Hi, all. I assume that people are coming in. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds to just make sure that we have people in here. And it looks like, yeah, we do have people joining. Let me give it another couple of seconds. Okay, so I'm going to begin. Thanks to all of you for joining me during these very strange times around the planet to talk about storytelling, which I think is an essential skill and a pleasure that will get us through these times. So we're going to talk today about characters and how to create them and how to make them engaging and interesting. Before we begin, I wanted to give you a pointer to this interface of this software, this platform that we're using. If you look on, I believe to the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a panel called Q&A. So you can type in questions and also upvote questions in that panel. And I'll leave maybe 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions, if there are any. So don't forget to do that. So as we begin, I think some or most of you will know who I am, but I just wanted to give you a sense. So I'm mostly a fiction writer. That book first on the list, Geek Sublime, is a nonfiction book. I've done some work in television and film. And if you want, you can go to that website there to find out more about my work. So what I wanted to begin with is a story that my friend Eric Simonoff, who is also my literary agent, and we've known each other for a long time now, very early on, he told me this story about another of his clients, this writer who was on book tour. And so what happens to writers on book tours is that you spend a lot of time in hotel rooms and in airports as you go from one place to the other. And so you always remember to take a couple of books with you, very fat books if you can find them. And so this writer that Eric was talking about was reading a book, and I'm trying not to give away spoilers here, so I'll try and be as vague as I can. So this writer was reading the fifth book in a series written by Anthony Trollope. And Anthony Trollope was a Victorian writer who specialized and was very good at writing these multi-volume sagas. So our friend, the writer, was in a hotel room, and he had just opened to the first page of this fifth volume. And in the very first paragraph, he saw that a character that Trollope had spent 4 other big novels developing in a really engaging and intimate way, Trollope kills that character off in that first paragraph. And the writer was so mad that he threw the book across the room and wouldn't be able to open it for another week. So I guess you could ask in a psychological sort of way, why do we do this, right? Because after all, when we are reading fiction or listening to it or watching to it, we know that the people that we're watching or reading about aren't really alive. It doesn't make any sense. Why do adult people do this? Or how are we engaged in this? How are we drawn into this? And I think the explanation that most satisfies me is one based around what researchers, psychologists, scientists, neurologists have called theory of mind. And a theory of mind is not, in this case, a formal theory which has a proposition that needs to be proved, etc. What they're talking about is, as Simon Baron-Cohen puts it here, by theory of mind, we mean being able to infer the full range of mental states that cause action, right? So if you want to think about it in a very basic way, if I'm sitting across a table from you, I know about my own consciousness, right? About my own interiority. I can feel it. But as far as I know, as I look across you at the table, across the table at you, you might be a robot, right? How do I know that you actually have an interiority, that you have consciousness? So what human beings do without ever realizing it, that based on the physicality of that which of those that we see, we instantly form, I guess you could call it a theory of their internal being, their internal state, right? And evolution has trained us to do this. If you have children, or if you've been around children, you'll notice that they start doing this from very early on. And they project consciousness into things like dolls. And we should remember also that even as adults, we keep on doing this, right? If you've ever felt affection for a car that you've owned for 20 years, you'll know what I mean, right? When you look up at a cloud and see a certain shape, without being able to help it, you see a face in it. So what I'm getting at is that human beings are constructed to watch other, to look out into the world and infer consciousness on the basis of outward external factors, right? And so this is what we as writers do. We take advantage of this. We draw a few lines, as it were, on the page, and through this, we engage with the reader, and the reader is then enabled to project consciousness on these artificial beings, right? Or these beings that don't actually exist. So the writer's craft then consists of figuring out how best to seduce the reader, if you want to call it that, into this belief, into this engagement. And so I would argue that one of the first methods that you deploy to do this is obviously physical detail. And this is a passage from an amazing short story by Elizabeth Tallant called No One's a Mystery. And if you read this with care, you'll notice a lot of details and actions here that create both of these characters here without us actually realizing that this is being done. So think about this. For my 18th birthday, Jack gave me a 5-year diary with a latch and a little key light as a dime. Now, what does this tell us about Jack, right? He gives her a diary, which is an interesting gift to give on an 18th birthday in a thematic way, because a diary allows you to write, to record yourself as you go through time, but with a latch and a little key light as a dime, right? If you've ever seen one of these diaries with these flimsy keys, you know that they're meant for children, right? This is a gift that you would give to a 7-year-old, not to somebody who's turning 18. Right? So it tells us something about Jack. We are then told he thought he saw his wife's Cadillac in the distance coming towards us, right? So we know instantly that he's married, and we're starting to have a sense of who he is. He pushed me down onto the dirty floor of the pickup and kept one hand on my head while I inhaled the musk of his cigarettes. Now, notice that action, right? That first of all, to hide this 18-year-old with whom I obviously at this point you suspect that he's having an affair, he pushes her down and she allows him to do it, right? So that gives us some measure of the alignment of power between these two people. Although I don't want to give away spoilers. Before we get to the end of the story, this expectation that is being set up on our part here is going to be upended. Notice also that as she's bent down there, she's looking up at him, where the seams of his Levi's was bleached linen white, although the Levi's were nearly new. I don't know why his Levi's always bleached like that along the seams and at the knees, right? And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us something about the kind of labor that he does, right? About the kind of work that he does. And in a curve of cloth, his zipper glinted gold, right? And this is, of course, a very slight allusion to sexuality, right? Well, maybe not so slight. So what I find marvelous about this is that without actually knowing, without actually the writer tipping us off in a very obvious way to what she is doing here, she creates magnificently both of these characters and their relationship in a very economical way. And I would argue that this is a much better way of creating character rather than doing, that kind of listing that you often see in fiction. Bjorn was 6 feet tall. He had broad shoulders. He had red hair. And that can get really obvious, and it can start to distract the reader from what you're actually trying to do, which is to create which is to create an engagement with the character, right? And it just feels clumsy. So the more subtle that you can be in this laying out of detail, the more that you can hide the fact that you're giving to the reader these details, both physical, mental, in terms of action, the more effective your narrative will become. So in addition to detail, what are the other techniques? So I'm sure that you've all have deployed point of view. You've read plenty about it. And I should say that point of view is probably the most powerful, one of the most powerful techniques that you can deploy in fiction. And also it is the most complex, right? I mean, one could go on and talk about point of view for a couple of hours. The reason also I've put focalization there is that because of this complexity, at least in the community of theoretical scholars, focalization is a term that has become more familiar and more common. The reason is that point of view implies, in a sense, that that this is purely a kind of cinematic technique, right? So that you could say the typical way of talking about point of view is to say that if the narrator knows everything and the narrator knows more than the characters, that is omniscient point of view, right? If it's limited omniscient, then the character knows, he acts a bit like a camera lens following the protagonist's actions and gestures from the outside. But point of view contains obviously a lot more than that, right? So you could ask questions like, to whom is this narrator speaking? Is she speaking directly to the reader, as in, I'm going to tell you a story, and then keeps on addressing the reader in that second person form? Or is she talking to another character, right? So that's one of my favorite methods of narrative architecture, in which one character tells a story to the other. So you have that. You have the question of time, right? If I say, once upon a time, Tom walked down the street, right? Then there is a kind of distancing that is achieved because I've introduced this idea of once upon a time, long, long ago. And then, of course, there's person, right? First person, second person, or third person. How do you attach that to any of these different points of view or different focalizations? I don't know. If you had a narrator who knows everything about all the characters and spoke in first person, that would probably have to be God, right? Speaking. But you can have, of course, the narrator knows as much as the focal character, or which is to say the protagonist. And you can do that in third person, or you can do that in first person, right? So you can say, Sam Spade walked down the street this Friday morning, or you can say, I walked down the street on this sunny Friday morning, right? And both of those has a certain distance associated with it, right? With the first person, you can get a much closer intimacy with the protagonist or the antagonist who is speaking. I should say also that it's not always the case that you want as much intimacy as you can get, or that third person is better than first person. It's all obviously a matter of context. So when I was writing one of my books, the last fiction that I wrote, which is a rather large novel about policemen and gangsters in India, in Bombay, in the first couple of drafts of it, I was writing both the cop, the protagonist, the two main protagonists, the cop and the gangster. I was writing both of them in third person. And for some reason, I knew that this wasn't quite working. It seemed off. And suddenly, I don't know how it came to me, I realized that I should write the gangster, the nominal bad guy, in first person, right? So as you read the book, there are different chapters told from the cop's point of view and from the gangster's point of view, you switch by chapter from third to first. And what that does, or what I think it did for me, was it allowed me to put the the reader uncomfortably within the mind of this gangster who in many ways is an amoral murderer. He's narcissistic, he's selfish, etc., etc. Right? And that's a very interesting position for the reader to be. The cop, who is, well, he's not so virtuous himself, he participates in corruption himself, but more or less he's a good guy, in a cliched kind of way, good guy in quotation marks. So you feel sympathetic towards him anyway, but this kind of tension between first person and being in the mind of somebody who's not so good, that became very interesting and hard to do in many ways for me, but very, very effective. And my wife, then my girlfriend, when she read the first complete draft that I gave her, she'd been reading it for a couple of days, and then one day she walked out of the room where she'd been reading, and she said, "I hate you for making me like this guy." Right? And that's when I knew that that I had been to some degree successful, pleasingly successful at pulling this off. So what can you do through point of view or focalization is maintain several different kinds of distances, right? I talked about temporal distance. You can also do geographic distance, right? On the other side of the world from Sam Spade, a bomb exploded, right? So you're able to achieve also by putting in that simple on the other side of the world, a kind of geographical distance. And then I think very, very importantly, perhaps most importantly, what you want to think about is psychic distance, right? And John Gardner, in this very good and famous book called The Art of Fiction, gives us these examples, right? So you can write about Henry J. Warburton in all of these kinds of ways. It was winter of the year 1853. A large man stepped out of a doorway, right? And here you see that temporal distance that I'm talking about, but notice also that it's a large man, right? He's not even named. So we get, it's a fairly abstract, long distance view of what is actually going on. In the second version, Henry J. Warburton had never much care for snowstorms. We get a name, but it's a formalized name, right? And it's a bit closer, but it's not quite as close as Henry hated snowstorms, right? Now you've got much more immediacy. You've got a first name, but you've also got a kind of active version of the sentence right above. And it's active in the sense that Henry is hating snowstorms, right? He's doing it. We're not just being told about it. And then God, how he hated these damn snowstorms, right? There's actual expression of emotion, right? So that the idea of Henry hated snowstorms is actually being now colored with emotion. And then finally, we get snow under your collar, down inside your shoes, freezing and plugging up your miserable soul. And now we are inside. We are very, very close. Now, also imagine in that last version, if we did that in first person, snow under my collar, down inside my shoes, freezing and plugging up my miserable soul, you'd get even more intimacy, right? So this kind of psychic distance is very, very important to consider as you write and as you revise, right? In a given scene, at a given moment, at what distance do you want your reader to be in terms of the emotion that is going on inside of the character? And notice again that you don't have to stick to any one of these throughout a book or throughout a short story. You could actually start with, it was winter of the year 1853, a large man stepped out of a doorway, and then go straight in the next paragraph to snow, Henry thought, under your collar, down inside your shoes, freezing and plugging up your miserable soul, right? So you can increase and decrease the psychic distance. One analogy that you might want to make here is with focal length in cinema, right? Or in the difference between a long shot and a wide shot. So switching from the wide shot to the close-up actually has a great energy of its own, right? because when in snapping back and forth, you create this movement, a kind of movement of psychic distance, as it were, that itself can be very effective. And you'll notice this in many, many writers who do this extremely well, right? So if you read Dickens, for instance, Dickens will often start chapters, and especially the beginnings of books, with these wide panoramic shots, right? These visions, London looms before you, its rooftops are slate colored, smoke rises like a dark stain, right? So you're getting this huge long shot view, and then he'll do some more of that, and then he'll cut down, as it were, to the lane below, and you'll suddenly be in third person, close up third person near a child who's miserable in the streets of London. The movement itself creates a kind of velocity that puts you at some points within the character and at some points outside the character. But both of those, in some sense, are equally important, right? Psychic distance of all sorts can be very effective, depending on the context within which it's deployed, and how effectively, of course, the writer is deploying it. We should next think about, I guess, what critics or scholars call various kinds of discourse, right? And which is to say, how do you represent the way that people actually talk to each other, or communicate with each other or within themselves within text? How can you do that? And so the first is direct discourse, which is it's an attempt at mimesis, right? It's an attempt to represent speech directly on the page. So what you're trying to do is to put exactly what a character is saying or characters are saying in the text. So as it were, the reader hears them inside his or her head, right? So this is what's being done here by Toni Morrison in this stream of dialogue. Often you get these little interjections, like he said and wiped his lips, that add texture to this direct discourse. This is immediate, right? In terms of psychic distance, you sometimes feel like you're actually watching people speak or hearing them speak. Also here within the dialogue, particularly in direct discourse, but in other kinds of discourse, which we'll see shortly, you can do a lot of work with rhythm, right? So you got off early, or what? I took off early, anything that matters. So those are short, sharp sentences that create a kind of sense of also how these characters talk to each other, of who they are themselves. And then also you can do work with syntax and accent, right? So notice, no, they got plenty work, right? So there's a slight error in locution or idiosyncrasy in locution. It's not they got plenty of work, it's they got plenty work, right? So you could call that, I guess, accent, right? On the very last line, you won't like what I'm about to say, right? Instead of about to say. So again, what you're doing is you're creating character through speech, right? Through representations of speech. The one thing that I would tell you to be really aware of is do accent with a very light hand, right? If you overdo it, you can make your characters sound like caricatures, and sometimes offensively so, right? You make them sound like cartoon figures. So, I mean, it's perfectly fine in your first or ninth draft to go overboard in dialogue and in everything else. But then as you revise and revise, to be aware of this and then cut it back, right? Bring back the accents perhaps to where the reader is, you're giving the readers hints about accents and locutions and rhythm, and the reader starts then reading these accents into the text itself. So I've always found myself doing a lot of work on this, right? Of going back and forth and deciding exactly what the right degree is. So we have direct discourse, and then we have what one could call indirect discourse, or what scholars call indirect discourse. This is again Toni Morrison. They were asleep, she said, and Seth was too ugly looking to wake them in the night, right? So here what is being done is that we're not being given the dialogue, as it were, in quotation marks. We are being told about the dialogue. And so one of the markers of indirect discourse is you often get he said, she said, these narratorial interjections, right? And then probably to me, one of the most powerful ways that you can represent narrative character interiority, even when you're in the third person, is what we call free indirect discourse or free indirect speech. So notice here, the hair was curled and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. It was a wretched business, right? And this is very subtle, but notice that we've lost, she thought, you could have written this, Jane Austen could have written this, it was a wretched business, she thought. Or she thought, quotation marks, it was a wretched business. But instead, what we get here is that those markers are taken away, right? He said, she said are taken away. So we go straight from Emma sat down to think and be miserable into the interiority of Emma, which is now kind of brought to the surface. So especially when you're writing in third person, what you can do with free indirect discourse is that you can engage with the interiority of the character and bring the reader into intimacy with that interiority transparently, right? And free indirect discourse has been around for centuries, but Jane Austen is, I think, correctly credited with one of the first modern writers to deploy it widely and effectively and use it anywhere in her books. So if you go and read Emma, watch for this, right? If you reread Emma, watch for how Jane Austen deploys this. And again, this is something that I've used widely and all over the place. And I love doing this, right? Because you can still stay outside in the third person, as in that cop in the crime novel that I was talking about. But I don't have to always be saying he thought or he mused and that kind of stuff, which can seem really clumsy and which introduces a psychic distance that I might not want in a particular moment of the story. Then moving on to this thing that I'm sure that all of you have heard of ad nauseum, right? If you've read any how to write fiction books, or you've listened to writers talk about writing fiction, or you've taken a workshop, I bet you've always been told create round characters, right? And this notion of the flat character and the round character, or at least this terminology, is taken from very famous writing, a book by E.M. Forster called Aspects of the Novel. And he writes, in their purest form, flat characters are constructed around a single idea or quality. When there's more than one factor in them, we get the beginning of the curve towards the round. Flat characters can be expressed in one sentence, right? And he gives us this example of Mrs. Micawber, Dickens' character, who throughout the entirety of her existence in the book has only one sentiment and one action. She keeps saying, I will never desert Mr. Micawber, right? So what is a round character? Often we conclude or we define what a round character is through a kind of negative way. We say a round character is a character that is not flat, right? By which we mean that round characters are multifaceted, right? They have many characteristics, and often those characteristics are paradoxical. They conflict with each other, right? So, I mean, if you think of your friends, I'm sure you have a friend who is extraordinarily shy, perhaps, but who overcomes that through a kind of forced attempt to overcome that shyness, and so seems aggressive to other people. Somebody who at one point in their life is really selfish and then overcome that through an act of generosity that is surprising to their friends. And this is what actually Forster points to, The test of a round character is whether it is capable of surprising in a convincing way. If it never surprises, it is flat. If it does not convince, it is a flat pretending to be round, right? So Forster, in very simple language, is getting a bit complex here. But so you don't want the surprise of a round character coming in a way that is unconvincing, right? Obviously, because then you haven't really done the work of creating a convincingly round character. But I think what he's referring to, which is very important, it has the incalculability of, I'm never able to pronounce that word, of life around it, life within the pages of a book, right? So like I was saying, round characters are complex, just like human beings are. They have incredible sort of contradictions within them, and for some reason, maybe because reading a nonfiction book about World War II last night, I have this rather grim example in my head. The Nazi officers who actually ran the concentration camps it's too easy to think of them as monsters, because if you actually read nonfiction accounts of them, they would spend a morning at the camps, and then they would come home and have lunch with their wives and children, drinking wine on a table that had a tablecloth. They would listen to classical music, and they would be kind to their dogs. And then after lunch, they would go back to the business of murdering people, mass murdering people, right? So that kind of contradiction is what we want to capture in a rounded character, right? And so instead of having the unmitigated evil of, I guess, what we would call of a comic book villain, right? You introduce complexity and subtlety and nuance even into the evil person, quote unquote evil person, right? But we'll come back to this in a second, right? To this question of round and flat. But Forster insists it is only round people who are fit to perform tragically for any length of time and can move us in any to any feelings except humor and appropriateness, right? So what he's arguing here is that you should be able to, especially in terms of your protagonist, or people who occupy the stage for any length of time within your fiction, that is more than minimal, they need to be round characters, right? And so you need to think about this and try and think about how they're contradictory. So you might be thinking, oh, well, this is all very good and theoretical. How the hell do you actually do this? So for me, my method is very, very unmethodical, right? It doesn't have any kind of system to it. I get the hint of a character, and then I spend a lot of time within that character, and slowly the history of that character starts to appear to me. I can then figure out what their contradictions are, where they come from, who their parents were, et cetera, and then that's how I find the roundness. And I think to a lot of people, that kind of searching is frustrating, or they get impatient, or I shouldn't say that their process and their method is actually very different. So this is an exercise that I've used in classes and workshops a lot, and I found it to be successful, right? So what I tell the students is, okay, I'm going to ask you 12 questions, and as soon as I ask you the question, a question, without thinking about the question or the answer too much, I just want you to write down something in your notebook. And if you can't think of an answer to one question, don't worry about it. Just go on to the next one, right? And then I start asking them these questions. The name, give me the name of a character. Then tell me one peculiar thing about how, where, or when this person was born. And they start writing, who hurt this person when they were young and how, right? And I rapidly ask them these questions. And so what I think that achieves is, without self-consciousness, without too much struggle, they start providing details, right, about this character that they've just started creating. So we get down to fantasy. They never told anyone. One famous person they hate. And then I think the last two questions become kind of crucial. Something in their life, their current life, that is, that makes them unhappy, right? So that gives you some sense of what is making them stir in this particular moment, where they might want to go toward, which leads directly into what do, that's a typo, sorry about that. What do they want, desire, long for? What's preventing them from getting it, right? So there, in that very last question, you've got absolute direction in which they can take action towards. And then what's preventing them from getting it gives you an idea of what might be the center for building conflict in your story around, right? And what is really interesting and fun about this exercise is that you can do it, in 10 minutes. And often students are surprised, in my experience, that by the time they finish this exercise in 10 minutes, I have them read out their answers to each other, and you get this kind of sudden illusion of an entire person, right? Which takes us back to theory of mind. You lay out a few details about a person, and then the human mind takes these details, sometimes contradictory, and builds them into this imagining of a complete person. Oh, and don't worry about writing these down, these questions down, if you're interested in doing this exercise. At the end of these slides, I'll point you to a page on our blog page where I wrote an entire essay about characters, in which you'll find these questions and the outline of this exercise. Okay, so we've been talking about flat characters, round characters, how to achieve roundness, and like I was saying, I bet you've been told that in writing workshops and in books that flat characters are less than satisfactory, right? Sometimes people will straight out come out and tell you that flat characters are bad, right? But even E.M. Forster admits that there's no fiction that has enough space so that you can achieve roundness for all of your characters, right? So what do you do with peripheral characters? Obviously, you don't have enough space to make them full of contradictions and give them as much backstory or history as your protagonist and your antagonist. Well, so then this exercise also becomes interesting and useful in that, to the degree that you're able to say, one peculiar thing about how or where this person was born, something interesting about how they dress or their body, that helps the reader imagine this, right? And again, the Victorian writers, Dickens, did this to a very large extent in their great multi-volume sagas. So Dickens will straight out come out and name somebody Mr. Longnose or something like that, right? So it's a pretty obvious thrust towards making you imagine Mr. Longnose as having a long nose, and therefore you remember him. But I also want to point out that maybe this what has, I think, become a kind of cliche about writing, that flat characters, or characters that don't contain as many details, as many incidental details as your depictions of round characters, that flat characters are lesser than round characters. I would argue against that a bit, right? So you're looking at this image on the screen, and I bet that each and every one of you knows, of course, who this is, right? Who this is a representation of. And of course, it's Sherlock Holmes, right? So when the first Guy Ritchie directed Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. was released, Charles McGrath, who is a very good film critic for the New York Times, wrote, "Holmes has probably had the most successful and elaborate afterlife than any fictional character has ever enjoyed." And it's true. Holmes is the first big multimedia star, right? He's appeared in countless movies, stage plays, and television series. And this multimedia stardom actually happened within the lifetime of Conan Doyle. He's whole shelffuls of sequels and knockoffs have been written about him. He's even been played by Daffy Duck. And so McGrath, in trying to think about what is it that makes Holmes such a popular figure, a universal global character, as it were, he thinks about this, and the only answer he seems to be come up with is that Conan Doyle is a really bad writer, right? So what he says is Holmes is so memorable because, like later superheroes, he's less a fully developed character than a collection of fascinating traits. Yet Holmes' vagueness and incompleteness on the page are what make him so irresistible as a pop figure on whom we can project our own interpretation. Right? And so it never seems to occur to Charles McGrath that what Conan Doyle is able to do is that he puts together a collection of fascinating traits in a very compelling and interesting way, so that then those collection of fascinating traits are what allows, as we were talking about in Theory of Mind, the readers to project their own imagining of Sherlock Holmes into those fascinating traits, right? And so what are those fascinating traits in reference to Holmes? Well, his violin playing, his smoking of that pipe that we just saw, his addiction to cocaine, his boredom with ordinary life, his hunger for detection, right? And so you can instantly see what McGrath is talking about, but he seems to regard this idea of a limited selection of fascinating traits as a kind of limitation rather than something that is very excellently done. And this is partly historical, right? So if you look at the pre-modern or even the early modern age, you'll actually realize that pre-modern readers and critics actually thought of the creation of character as a kind of economy of traits, right? So as Henry Galley, he wrote this famous essay on what he called characteristic writings. He says, an author must not dwell too long upon one idea. As soon as the masterly stroke is given, he must immediately pass on to another idea, right? So the idea is that you take a certain amount of strokes, as he calls them, or as one could call traits, like Charles McGrath actually does. And if you can get a very, very few of them and put them on the page, or as it were, that's the virtue of the writer, right? Within the context, the critical context that he is talking about. This is actually true in pre-modern India as well. Here is a 16th century critic and poet who is arguing, who's talking about classification, right? And Naika is heroine. So what he's saying is that the heroine's different classifications derive from her different temporary states, right? And so you can have the heroine who's jealous, or the heroine who's longing for her lover, but these are all types, right? They're not rounded characters as such in the way that E.M. Forster would describe them, but they are they're collections of traits, right? And then Bhanudatta actually gives us an example, which is this erotic poem. The speaker here is a woman who is speaking to her friend, and she says, the house was empty and I'd used every charm I knew, so I took him to the woods. Not a soul was there on the pretext of picking flowers, and I looked at him with longing and pretended to offer him betel. I let him see my breasts in full. He still doesn't get the point. Oh, go between, or oh, friend, what must I do to make him get it? Right? So the man here is being, as is often unfortunately the case, being rather oblivious and dumb. But the point that Bhanudatta is making here is that the heroine here is a characteristic, is she has a desire, and so she is the lovelorn heroine who is not getting what she wants, right? So we don't know here what kind of coffee she likes to drink, or whether she brushes her teeth in the morning with one particular kind of toothpaste or the other, but all the same, we are engaged with her, right? So if you think of pre-modern heroes and heroines, the couple that come to my mind, one is of course somebody like Achilles, right? So what do we know about Achilles? We know that he's proud, that he's a great warrior, that once you offend his pride, he gets very angry. We also know that despite his prowess at arms, he's also very compassionate. Remember when Priam comes to him to beg for the body of his dead son, Achilles does respond to him with sympathy. In the Indian tradition, one of my favorite characters in the Mahabharata is Karna, who is a magnificent warrior who has been abandoned by his mother, who is magnificently loyal to his friends, even though his friends are fighting on the wrong side. So we get these what I like to think of as epic characters or pre-modern characters. Epic characters is probably a better way of thinking about them, who are Sherlock Holmes-like in that, again, we don't know about Karna, which kind of fish he likes to eat, right? Or does he like, I don't know, rasgullas better than gulab jamuns? We don't, those are Indian sweets, by the way, for those of you who are non-Indian. But in some sense, despite that lack of detail, despite that pointillism, we still are powerfully engaged with these pre-modern characters as we are with Sherlock Holmes. So what is my point in all of this is that when you create character, think deeply about the context that you're creating this character within, right? I was going to show you this slide next, but anyway, so I want to talk about characters for a couple of moments. So think about the context within which you are creating characters, right? So if you're writing a novel within what one might call the genre of modern literary fiction, then you want to have, of course, a deeply rounded character, a set of deeply rounded characters containing all of those toothpaste and coffee details that I was just talking about, in order to give them texture in the right manner. On the other hand, if you're writing a tight thriller in which the emphasis is on the action, you might want to actually think about them, about your characters in more Sherlockian terms, right? Who is going to be the Moriarty to your Sherlock, right? That's the question that you might want to ask. And in the interests of narrative economy and narrative speed, you might cut down a bit on the kind of other kind of detail that you might put into literary fiction. And you'll notice in terms of effectiveness, you will notice this happening in the summer tentpole superhero movies that you go to see, right? One of my favorite superhero movies of the last few years was Wonder Woman, right, with Gal Gadot. And I thought that was terrific. And again, there, I didn't really care as a viewer, which brand of coffee that Diana preferred when she comes to London. What I was interested in was the larger outlines and the epic outlines of that character and how powerfully those moved me. Powered, of course, there by the actor's charisma and the actor's talent. Okay, so we're kind of running out of time, so I wanted to point at you at a couple of places where you might want to read more about this. Janet Burroway's book is a book that I recommend often to writers, to all writers. It's comprehensive, it's practical. The reason that I put 10th edition in there is that earlier editions used to cost a lot of money, $60 odd, if I'm remembering correctly, because those also had short stories within, those editions had short stories within them. And so you were paying for the copyright payments for those short stories. The 10th edition, they've removed the short stories, but they're all fairly famous ones, so you'll be able to find them. So I think it's like somewhere between $10 and $13, depending on whether you buy paperback or ebook. The ebook version. The Art of Fiction by John Gardner is another one of my favorite books about writing. He's erudite and a wonderful stylist, a nonfiction and fiction stylist. So it's a pleasure to read his prose. So you should absolutely, if you're interested, go also and look at John Gardner's work and also then read his fiction. If you want to read more about all these ideas about characters. If you go to the blog that's in that first link, you'll find at that location, you'll find this essay, or just go to blog.granthika.co and you'll be able to find the character essay. On Roadmap, we have there's a page for ideas for webinars. So if you'd like me to talk about other stuff, other themes, other subjects, you can leave suggestions there. And then if you leave comments on the character essay, I'll find them on the forums at the bottom and be able to interact with you there. And also, if you want to talk about other stuff anyway, you can always go to the forums and start a discussion there. Okay, so I'm going to go back off the slides and let me see if there are questions. Q&A. Let me see. I think interesting. There's not much more about characters. I have to pass through 5 or 6 drafts, and that's a painful and depressing process. I'm afraid there's no way to actually get past revision. And I should say that you never, ever make art on the first try out. I like to tell my students that you only find art through revision, and then you go bit by bit, piece by piece, and then you finally then find some kind of success in very, very later versions. I've written, for my last nonfiction books, I think I wrote 38 revisions, so there's no way to get around that. I just saw a question flash by. I'm not sure why it disappeared, about how do you create interiority for characters in a visual medium like cinema as opposed to fiction? And I think that's a very good question. I guess one should step back first and say that fiction is unique in giving you this deep access to interiority, right? That you can engage in first person or third person or even omniscient views of the characters' thinking, of their emotions, and which I have worked in film and television, and that's the part of writing for film and television that I found the hardest, right? That in those media, you have to externalize emotion and thought, right? You can do monologue, you can do voiceover, but again, you have to do that with a really light hand. Otherwise, it ends up becoming really kind of obvious and clumsy, and it starts to clang for the reader, and you can't do it anymore. But you shouldn't do it too much. So couple of things that I've used myself in the past, of course, and again, this can seem clumsy, but having a character tell another character what they're feeling actually works. You have to depend a lot on the acting chops of your performers, right? So that often then in close up, you're able to then make visible what might be within an actor, within a character, through the actor's body, right? But in order to do that, you've got to give the actor enough to work with, right? And that, I think, is really the screenwriter or the film writer's craft, is that even within a scene, you give them Can you guys hear me? I'm going to keep on
I'm sorry. He will be back in a second. Just a very quick reset. Just a couple of technical difficulties, but hang in there. He'll be back. He's still trying to come back online. Just a second. I'm sorry, but if for some reason he doesn't, we'll be able to answer the questions that you guys posted on the forum. Oh, there. I think he's back.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Hang on one second. Let me try and see. Sorry for the communication difficulty, guys. What the hell is going on? Technology always breaks down on you. Can you see me?
Yes, you're back.
I'm back. Well, I'm really sorry about that, guys. My computer acting weird. Okay, so hope we haven't lost too many people. Hi, Naid. She asks, I think Hilary Mantel too does an excellent job of writing flat characters a la Dickens. Any other modern writers that you'd recommend? I'm trying to think. For some reason, the person that I'm thinking of is right now are some of the people who do magic realism. And I'm thinking of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but not in terms of his protagonists or the main characters, because those are enormously complex, filled out people. But if you go and read 100 Years of Solitude, for instance, and carefully watch how the peripheral characters, the people who don't have too much stage time, what a powerful impression they make. It's incredible how he does that, right? So that when you think of his universe in a complete kind of way, what you notice is how filled that universe is with living, breathing people, right? Oh, I didn't mean to reiterate the title of the essay, but I really feel when I enter his books that I'm entering an entire living universe, and I love living there for a while, and I feel bereft when I come out of that world. And I think again, which reminds me, and I keep repeating myself about this in various ways, if there is a character or characters who have engaged you, who have captured you, go and read that book 10 times, go and read it 20 times, until you can start to observe what is it that the writer did to produce that effect in you. And for that, I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, his work. Another book of his that I love is called Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and it's very short. And again, it's startling how engaging he makes his people. I try and read The Great Gatsby once a year, right? Just to remind myself of what great writing can do. So find your favorite books like that and read them and reread them. Somebody asked, is the protagonist always a round character while the side characters are always flat? I would say that yes. Well, a qualified answer to that. The protagonist needs to be, in a literary novel at least, needs to be rounded, right? Because otherwise I won't be engaged. I won't feel like I know this character well enough. The peripheral characters, even in a literary novel, well, you can have a certain degree of flatness to them, but I don't think they should be simple caricatures either, unless they're total walk-ons, right? If there is a person who gets the post and a mailman comes and drops a letter in her hand, I don't think you need to really develop the mail person. But other than that, I would try and make everyone as complex as possible. Again, it also depends on the genre, right? So if you're writing, I'm trying to think of, what would be an equivalent to Sherlock Holmes in contemporary times. Oh, I don't know if all of you will have heard of this, the Jack Reacher novels. Tom Cruise, they're by a writer named Lee Child, and Tom Cruise was the star in a couple of movies that they made based on those novels. And the protagonist, Jack Reacher, is pretty much always the same, right? He's the 6-foot-something ex-military policeman who wanders around the United States, vanquishing evil, right? And I think it's okay for a character like him to stay, as it were, formulaic, right? Because in a sense, when you're reading that kind of fiction, that kind of comforting formulaicness is what you want, right? That you expect and you're feeling with. Let's see. When and how much a writer working towards coming up with craft of style, read up on craft of style character building. Is it an ongoing process or a prerequisite to invest? I would say it's very much an ongoing process, right? So I don't think like you need to spend 2 years doing research on how to build characters, how to make characters according to, these 12 wise people, famous writers, and then go and start writing a book. That's absolutely not the way that you should do it. Creating any kind of style is a process. Any kind of art is a process. You want to explore that process for yourself and the chemistry of that process in terms of how it works for you. And in finding what it works for you, you'll develop a sense, your own gut sense of what you should do and what you should not do, right? And what makes your own writing the most effective, and then you keep executing that. You keep doing it again and again. So I would say do it simultaneously. The other thing I would say is that you should take my advice, what I'm saying here today, and every book that you ever read and every lecture that a critic or writer gives with a huge bucket of salt, right? Because it's not a general, there aren't these general principles of writing that you can apply like an algorithm to your own work and you'll produce successful work on the other side. Right? Like I just used the word chemistry. It's a chemistry that happens very deep within yourself, not just in your intellect, but also in your body, right? And so it's hugely individual. Each person does it differently. And often, especially when I was younger, I used to read these books on how to be a writer, and I would think, oh, there's these 16 things I'm not doing, so I'm failing, and that's not the way to think about it at all. I think we're running out of time. So because I blipped out on you guys for a second, let me see if there's any Other questions that I can answer before we all go back to real life, as it were. Let's see. For literary fiction, my tone changes when I write at different times. How should I be focused on a similar voice for each characters? Is it okay if it changes as they? Oh yes, of course, yeah. So again, I would in answer to that question, I would refer back to real life, right? So like I was talking about your friend who has a certain consistency in personality, right? People are generally the same yesterday as they were today, and yet contradictorily they change over time, right? Or it's not a contradiction. That's how human beings are. It's the nature of life itself. So what you want to do is to present change in a convincing way, right? That's really the challenge. So if you have somebody who is who's kind of timid as a child, but who becomes, by the time they're a teenager, brave and aggressive. I've seen that happen with people, but how exactly did it happen? Was there something in their life that acted upon them, some conflict that they faced that actually forced them to act that way? The way of speaking will change as they get drawn into certain sort of domains, as their education increases. So change is essential for characters in all domains, right? And then remembering, if you remember back to E.M. Forster, remember that he said that rounded characters, by definition, are the ones that surprise us, right? And I would extend that to change of any sort, right? So that both all-round characters, in their effect on us, are going to do that through change, right? So if you think about the one of the typical narrative structures is from innocence to experience, right? That's about change. And if you're going to make, as you often must do, to make your protagonist go through conflict, and if that conflict is substantial, of course they'll change, right? So it's their voice, their attitude towards the world, their way of speaking, all of this will change as they move through the world. And that's actually one of the great pleasures of reading convincing fiction or reading engaging fiction, right? I was talking about disappearing into a fictive universe. And for me, watching that fictive universe evolve is one of the most satisfying parts of engaging with fiction. It's the major source of pleasure, right, that I gain from fiction. And I think we are now almost completely out of time. I have to go back into my house to my kid care duties that I'm now a little late on. So I think I heard Asya say, please come to the forums and engage over there, and I'll find you there, and we can continue the discussion there. All right. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for participating, and I will see you next time.